All right, here we are. So today, now I just realized that we never went over the chapter 17 problem set. So we'll have to do that today. And then we also have the chapter 18 problem set, oligopoly. And then finally, we have a sample midterm, sample final rather, which we need to go over today. And when all that's done, we'll be 100% ready for the final exam. So let me get all three of those open right now. Here's the sample final. And so we'll go through these three. Now, if you look at the calendar, let's see, I don't think I have it right in front of me. So let's go open the calendar. Oh, let's see. Yeah, so the idea here, now they've got listed here the finals week as next week. Okay, so it looks like if we're done with these three reviews, chapter 17, 18, and 9, and the final, then we're actually done with everything. And so that means that I can actually post the final exam today. And then now how much time I can give you for it, I have to look it up, but it'll be a minimum of a week because supposedly we're taking our exams during the week of the 10th anyway, and today is only the 4th. So I think our best strategy is to finish up the two problem sets and the sample final today. And then I'll post probably this afternoon, the final. And then what I'll have to do is I will either put an announcement on Blackboard or I'll send you emails letting you know the exact deadline at which you should have them ready, but it'll be at least a week. It might be more because, like I said, theoretically, our final exam should have been either the 11th or possibly the 14th. So that way you can have even more time than usual if you need it. And then in the meantime, if you really are stuck or if you are having problems, you can send me emails. So why don't we just wrap it up today and I'll post the exam, certainly if not this afternoon, by tonight. So you'll have it there and then I'll let you know when you can have it back, but you can count on at least a week. All right. In other words, it'll be no sooner than midnight on Tuesday, the 11th. So it's not going to take that long. As you know from the other exams, it should not take more than, well, whatever it took for the last two. This one will not be any longer because it's not comprehensive. Remember, the final exam only counts or covers chapters 15 through 18, which is our discussion about market structures. Okay, so in other words, 15 for perfect competition, 16 for monopoly, 17 for monopolistic competition, and then finally 18 for oligopoly. And then that's it, we're done. So then you can go on and take, let's say, intermediate micro, or maybe you should take macro if you haven't already. You should ideally have both of them so you get a better perspective of what economics is all about. Of course, here we focus on the small details. In macro, we look at the big details, and that way you have a complete picture of the economy. Okay, or if you're an economics major, of course, you would then at some point want to take intermediate micro, where really they take more of a deeper look at all of these topics and then introduce a few new ones as well. All right, so anyway, let's look at 17. Now, if you notice here, for 17, it says identify three characteristics of a monopolistically competitive market. Oops, I wrote more than three, just to have a complete set. Of course, that means you can pick any three. The ones you want to put down, that's fine. But the five that basically are the most important are that we have a large number of firms. And remember, if you forget some of these characteristics, just try to think of a real world example. In this case, we talked about how fast food could be considered a monopolistically competitive market. So you know that there's a lot, and I mean a lot, of fast food firms out there. And each one produces a product which is maybe similar, but it's not identical, which means it's differentiated. There's some way in which you can tell them apart. Okay, so I can tell if I'm eating a burger from Burger King's versus McDonald's. I know the difference. All right. Then because of that, the firms can compete on price. They can compete on quality, and they can compete on other features. For example, McDonald's has Happy Meals that the others don't have. And they all have some little thing that the others don't have. And so that's what we mean by features. They all advertise, or they tend to advertise a lot, as a matter of fact. Okay, that's because they're trying to install this idea in your mind that they're very much better than their competitors. And so they're trying to establish brand loyalty. And then finally, it's easy to enter and exit this industry. Okay, in the sense that there's no legal barriers. Okay, and there's also no cost advantages to the existing firms. Anyone can do this. Anyone can have their own fast food chain. Of course, money is an issue, but if that's the only issue, then we consider this to be easy to enter and exit. Now, collusion, which we agree that is not likely to happen with monopolistic competition, it's a case where firms agree among themselves what prices they will charge in the market. All right. Now, we did see in the oligopoly chapter that that does sometimes happen. It's easier, though, with an oligopoly because there's only a few firms. But it's hard to imagine that all of the fast food restaurants out there could actually get together and agree among themselves what prices to charge, because there's just so many of them and they all have conflicting interests. It's like getting any group of people together and agreeing on anything. Imagine if you're trying to decide what to do with a group of 10 friends, and some people want to go to the baseball game, some people want to go to the movies, some people want to go to a restaurant. It's going to be tough to come to an agreement. That's just the way it is. Anyway, fortunately, collusion is illegal in the United States, which makes it much harder, although it still happens. But the penalties are very, very severe, to say the least. So when it happens, it often ends up resulting in enormous fines, which means that the firms engaged in collusion do not profit from it. In fact, they end up being very much worse off once they're caught. All right, now, how about the key differences between perfectly competitive firms and monopolistically competitive firms? All right, there's quite a few of them. But obviously, in a monopolistically competitive industry, you expect to have fewer firms than in a perfectly competitive industry. There may be a lot of firms in monopolistic competition, but not as many as you would get in perfect competition. The good being sold in a perfectly competitive market is identical for all firms, while monopolistically competitive firms sell what we call a differentiated product. Okay, even if the differences are very subtle, the fact that you can tell them apart means that the goods are differentiated as opposed to being identical. And then finally, a monopolistically competitive firm has at least some control over the price that it charges, while a perfectly competitive firm does not. Now, that control might be very minimal, but a McDonald's, let's say, could raise their prices and not lose all their customers like would happen in a perfectly competitive industry. It might prove to be a mistake, but they can do it, and they wouldn't just lose all their customers. Now, what is one important way in which monopolistically competitive firms compete with each other? Well, we already saw that earlier up here, one of the other questions. It's price, quality, and features. So we talked about quality with respect to Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks. They do, well, I think, although it's a matter of opinion, a lot of people would agree that Starbucks coffee is a little bit higher quality, but because of that, it is more expensive. And there's a market for both, for inexpensive coffee and expensive coffee. And so each one is sort of operating in a different part of the market. You couldn't get that with perfect competition because nobody would be able to tell the coffees apart. The price, they can charge their different prices. As we know, Starbucks is more expensive than Dunkin' Donuts. And then features, those are the special little things that only that individual company has. Like, for example, Dunkin' Donuts has really good donuts, and that's why they're called Dunkin' Donuts. And you don't really get that with Starbucks. You get some food, but not those wonderful donuts. So that's how they compete with each other, or three ways they can compete with each other. Why do monopolistically competitive firms advertise? Because it enables them to increase brand loyalty. You would think that they wouldn't want to waste their money on advertising, but they find that it works. The fact that they keep doing it proves that it must work. Otherwise, they wouldn't waste their money. So when you see ads on TV all the time for the same companies, that is a signal that it is working for them. They're making more money. They're attracting more customers. Otherwise, I'm sure the advertising is very expensive. So the fact that they keep doing it is proof that it must be working for them. Now, we know that it would make no sense for perfectly competitive firms to advertise because they're all selling the same product. There's no need for it with oligopolies because there's only 2 or 3 major firms selling more or less the same thing. And with a monopoly, what do they care? They're the only game in town. If you want that product, you have to come to them. So if Standard Oil was still around today, you can be sure that they would not waste their money advertising on TV. All right. Anyway, so the firm concentration ratio is the percentage of the total revenues of the 4 largest firms in an industry. It's a very useful measure to help the Justice Department analyze how concentrated an industry is before they decide if a merger should be allowed or not. It's not the only measure, as we know. Like, for example, this HHI index, which represents the sum of the squares of the market shares of all the firms in that industry. And so if there's a monopoly, there's only one firm, it has 100% of the market share. So 100 squared is 10,000. And that's why it's 10,000. It's 100 squared. Now, let's look at this one, 9. What is the 4-firm concentration ratio for an industry in which the largest 4 firms each account for 20% of total revenues? Well, in a case like this, you're basically just adding up 20% for each of the first 4 or the biggest 4, and you wind up with 80% as your total. That's a pretty big concentration. That most likely that would be indicative of an oligopoly, or at least getting very close to it, because that means there's essentially 4 large firms dominating the industry, although there are others as well. But that's a big number. But the way we got it was to add up for 20, 20, 20, and 20, we add them up, and we get a total of 80%. Now, of course, if this was a monopoly, it would just be 100% because one firm has the whole industry to itself. Now, formally, the cutoff point with this ratio is 60% seems to be the cutoff point between monopolistic competition and oligopoly. So once we get up above 60, we're looking at oligopoly. And then monopoly, of course, would be 100%. Well, I mean, in a case like that, the way it's structured, this is one of the awkward parts about the 4-firm concentration ratio. If you had 4 firms, each with 25% of the market, then the concentration ratio would be 100. And the same thing would be true with the monopolies. So when you start getting up into the large numbers, it starts to become harder to tell what kind of market structure you have. But once you get above 60, you're considered to have either an oligopoly or a monopoly. Now, what condition represents profit maximizing output for a monopolistically competitive firm? This is true for all industries. It's not because it's a monopolistic competitor. MR always equals MC. That is like, maybe if there is such a thing as a golden rule in economics, this would be it. Every firm wants to maximize their profits, and they can only do that by producing where MR equals MC. Now, what kind of profits are earned by a monopolistically competitive firm in the long run? We assume that, like with perfect competition, in the long run, there's so many of them competing for the same customers that they'll end up making 0 economic profits in the long run. In the short run, they can earn more than that. But because once they start making money, other firms are likely to come in and join the industry. In the long run, we'd expect them all to make 0 economic profits, which, as you recall, doesn't mean they're making no profits. It means that they're just covering their opportunity costs. Markup, we only maybe mentioned this once. It's the difference between the price charged by a firm and the marginal cost of producing it. Okay, now with perfect competition, that would mean that there's no markup. They're just charging whatever it costs to make it. But for other industries, the price is likely to be higher than the marginal cost. And so the difference between the two is called markup. It's like when you go to the supermarket and you spend, let's say, I don't know, $2 for milk, and maybe it only costs the company $1.50 to make it. That means there's a markup of 50 cents. All right, excess capacity means that the amount by which the efficient scale exceeds the actual quantity being produced. Now, efficient scale is the one, if you recall, way back in chapter 17, where ATC is minimized. If you're producing at the point where the average total cost is minimized, we call that the efficient scale, but many companies don't produce there. So the gap between what they're actually producing and this output is referred to as excess capacity, which means they're producing more than is absolutely efficient.
Thing we had one interaction with, and he will forever remain a character.
Oh, that was it. Okay. All right. So I forgot there was only fill-ins here. All right. So let's go on to 18 now. 18, I think, was the same. I don't believe that there's any word problems in 18. A lot of, oh, here it is. Are there any? Oh, that's right. We have some game theory here. Yes. Now, remember, I mentioned that there's not going to be any questions about game theory on the actual test. Not because it isn't a valid, area of study, but because we didn't really have that much time to really learn it very well. It's just, we just barely got to be introduced to it, which it's an interesting idea. But it takes a while to really get used to it. So because we don't have that kind of time, what we'll do is it's in here, but and I'll show you how you would figure this out, but it won't be on the test. I don't think that would be fair. Anyway, so in the meantime, what is the name of an oligopoly with two firms? Well, it's just duopoly. Now, I suppose if there was three firms, they might try to call it a triopoly, but you don't normally hear that word tossed about. Normally, it's either oligopoly, duopoly, monopoly. That's pretty much it. Anyway, what are two of the key characteristics of an oligopoly? Well, there's very few firms, okay? At least two, of course, and it could be like 8 or 10, but pretty much you're looking at a small number of firms that dominate the industry. So that's when it becomes an oligopoly as opposed to monopolistic competition. And here there are significant barriers to entry. Often those revolve around what we will call economies of scale. In other words, these are the types of industries where it pays to be big. And so because of that, there tends to be only a few gigantic producers like aircraft, Boeing and Airbus, for example. They're enormous companies, but producing aircraft is a hugely capital intensive industry where the enormous amounts of advanced equipment are required. And so it just wouldn't make sense for a small company to try to compete in this market. So that's why you've got two. And even as it is, Airbus, there's been a lot of controversy about this, but the French government, in the past at least, has been caught subsidizing Airbus to give it an unfair edge over Boeing because it's such an expensive thing to do to produce aircraft that for a while they were unable to do it and make a profit without the subsidies from the French government. And in the US, there used to be more aircraft producers, but now it's down to basically one or two. Again, it's because it's such an intense industry to compete in, and the costs are very, very high. And also, let's face it, there's limited demand for aircraft. How many different airlines throughout the world need new aircraft at any given time? So it's a very different industry than, let's say, fast food. Oh, here's that question about collusion again. Now, this is more relevant to oligopoly because here you're far more likely to see it happening. They get together and say, listen, why should we compete with each other? Why don't we just all set the same price and be done with it? And that would work, except for the fact that it's illegal. And eventually, when they get caught, they end up paying enormous fines. And so let's just say that they probably will try to avoid this if possible. Now, with oligopolies, there often are significant barriers to entry. There might be legal barriers. And there could also be economies of scale, which is, like I said before, this is when it pays to be big. And in fact, this leads up to question 5. What are economies of scale? Well, these occur when the long run average total cost declines as more units are produced. So in other words, as you keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the costs of production are getting smaller per unit, that is. So this is why it would be difficult or impossible for other firms to compete when we have economies of scale like this. Now, natural, in this sense, just like with monopolies, natural means that they have an edge because of their cost advantages. So we call that a natural oligopoly because it occurs due to the lower costs that occur with economies of scale. We can have a legal oligopoly where the government provides them with protection, but a natural oligopoly, just like a natural monopoly, means that it exists, this industry, because of cost advantages, which means economies of scale, like steel making or aircraft making. In other words, so you've got a few gigantic dominant firms because of their cost advantages. Now, here's our old friend, the HHI index. Oligopoly, remember, it can go as high as 10,000, but it only needs to reach 2,500 or so before the industry is considered to be an oligopoly. Now, I threw in one game theory question. Remember, this won't be there, but it's a strategy chosen by two players where each one chooses their best option given the strategy of the other player. In other words, it isn't necessarily the best choice for you, but because you're in a situation where your payoffs are interdependent with the other player, your decision has to be based on not only what works for you, but what works well for the other player. So let me just show you how you would figure this out. Now, I did mention the other day that, here you've got to be careful because I wasn't able to produce one of those beautiful diagrams that we had in the book. But here, the way to interpret this is that the first payoff in each set of ordered pairs payoff 1 and payoff 2. So that means this payoff belongs to Pepsi. You can tell because Pepsi's over here on the left. And then this is Coke, whose payoffs are on the top. Oh, one more thing. You know what I wanted to do before we forget? Economies of scale. I just wanted to draw a quick sketch here so you can remind yourself what this is all about. LATC stands for long run average total cost. Okay, and you can see as Q gets bigger, the average cost gets smaller. This is an industry like this. This is what we mean by economies of scale. And when we see this, it's very likely that this industry will turn into an oligopoly because, like I said, it pays to get bigger. The bigger you get, the cheaper your product will be to produce. And therefore, you'll have a huge advantage over your competitors. So you would expect to see this in the big industries like steel and aircraft production. All right, just a quick reminder. Now, so down here, all right, so here we go. So here's Pepsi and here's Coke. Now, let's walk through all these. Now, imagine that you find yourselves, both companies decide, let's not advertise. The payoffs are 50-50. That means each company is making 50. Let's say that's $50 million. Now, here's the thing. Pepsi is choosing between advertising and not advertising. If they're in this cell right now, if Coke is not advertising, Pepsi could actually increase their payoff by advertising. In other words, if they're in this cell, that means if they switch over to advertising and Coke doesn't respond to that, then all of a sudden Pepsi's payoff is 80 and Coke goes all the way down to negative 10. Ooh. So Pepsi could really score big by switching over to advertising. But the thing is, Coke is aware of this. And so if Coke sees us start advertising, they'll start advertising too, because then their payoff can suddenly go to 20 and will knock ours down to 20. So if we start advertising, Coke will advertise and we'll find ourselves at 2020. Now, if we decide to stop advertising as Pepsi by moving down here, our profits or payoff will drop from 20 to negative 10. So we have no reason to do that. So the bottom line is they're going to end up in this cell right here, because once we're here, neither side has a reason to change their decision. In other words, once we get to the cell, Pepsi would reduce their profits by stopping their advertising, and so would Coke. Okay, so in other words, once we've reached this cell, neither side has an incentive to change their decision or their strategy. So even though this is not the best payoff for either one of them, like for example, theoretically, Pepsi could make 80 in the cell in the upper right-hand corner, and Coke could make 80 in the bottom left-hand corner. But that's not really feasible because moving to that cell would cause the other side to react. So this 2020 is the best that we can both jointly hope for. And so therefore, that is referred to as our Nash equilibrium. Oh, because at least one of them has an incentive to change. That's why. In other words, if we're at 50-50, the problem then is that Pepsi is going to switch to advertising. And that means that their profits will go up to 80 temporarily, but then Coke will realize what's happening and they'll switch over to advertising. That's the thing. Yes, you're right. At 50-50, you would say, well, why don't we just stay here? Well, no, because Pepsi says, oh, let's advertise. And then Coke says, no, and then maybe we'd better advertise. So it's because it's like, now, by the way, I just want to point out that if Coke and Pepsi form a cartel, which you know is very difficult, then they'll do exactly that, where they both say, listen, what are we doing? Why are we spending all this money in advertising? They will both decide not to advertise. That's a very good point, because then they're going to both get 50-50, but they have to be agreeing. You see, there's the problem. They have to have an agreement among themselves. And even then, they both have to worry that the other might cheat and switch over. So in other words, if we're sitting here at 50-50, Coke has to be constantly worrying that Pepsi will suddenly decide one day to start advertising. So the only way we can reach 50-50 is if we have a cartel. Without a cartel in place, both sides, or always at least one side, has an incentive to switch. And that will likely bring a reaction from the other side, so that the only place where we have no incentive to change is at 2020. And so that becomes our Nash equilibrium. In fact, I was thinking of this the other day. There's a TV show called House Hunters, if you've ever seen it, where they have a couple who's looking for a new house. And, on the show, they find them 3 houses. And usually what happens is the husband loves one house and the wife hates it. Then there's another house where the husband hates it and the wife loves it. And then there's a third house where they both kind of like it. And so they'll end up typically with the third house where they both kind of like it, because even though it's not the best house for either one of them, it's the best house for both of them. And that's the key to the whole thing. And you can think of that as the Nash equilibrium when they pick a house which is not perfect for either one of them, but it's good for both of them. And so that's exactly what's happening here. So now, by the way, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Game theory is a very, very complicated area of study. You're just seeing some very basic fundamentals. It can get very complex and intense very quickly, but it's a good way to introduce the topic. And you can see, as we saw in the slides, why it can be applied to oligopolies, because let's say there's only two firms. Well, I mean, this is exactly what they have to think about. They can't just arbitrarily set their own prices. They have to realize that whatever they do, the other side might react and change everything. So they have to take into account their competitors' reactions whenever they make a decision. Now here, this one involves Procter & Gamble and Kimberly-Clark. These are both producers of household items that you have in your house, I guarantee it. They make laundry detergent and shampoo and soap and detergent and everything you can imagine that you use on a daily basis. I'm sure you don't notice I mean, you're looking typically at the brand names, not the manufacturers. But I'm sure, like Tide, for example, belongs to Procter and Gamble. You probably have. Now, here, it's a similar idea. R&D, by the way, stands for research and development. I think I should have put that in here. So research and development is how companies develop new products. Now, you would think that they all do research and development, and they probably do to a certain degree, but not necessarily. So here, the strategy is between spending a lot of money on R&D or not. So again, if you look at these cells, like if, let's say we look down here, now this, there doesn't seem to be any one cell that's clearly much better for both of them, but this one looks pretty promising, I think. But again, if you look at it carefully, you'll see that if we're in this cell, Kimberly-Clark wants to go up here. And when that happens, Procter & Gamble is losing 10. So they would say, well, you know what, if that's the case, let's go over here to 545. And again, once they reach this point, Kimberly-Clark does not want to switch over to no R&D because they'll go from 5 to negative 10. And Procter & Gamble will not want to switch back to no R&D because they'd be at negative 10. So just like before, this is where we end up, because at this point, nobody has any incentive to change their strategy. At all the other cells, if you look at them carefully, you'll see that one side has, or both of them, would like to switch. Okay, so let's say from down here, Kimberly-Clark would move up. From here, as you've already seen, Kimberly-Clark will move up. And then, of course, if we're in this cell over here, our Procter & Gamble will switch over. So this is the only place where nobody wants to switch. So that means they'll both spend on R&D, and these will be their payoffs. Now, Kimberly-Clark knows that, let's face it, they'd rather be over here, but it can't be done, because once they move into this no R&D column, Procter & Gamble will respond by doing their own R&D. Okay. In fact, you can tell in this column, Procter & Gamble does not want to be in this column, no matter how you look at it, no matter what Kimberly-Clark is doing. If look at these numbers, if Kimberly-Clark is doing R&D, Procter & Gamble wants to do their own R&D. For down here with no R&D by Kimberly-Clark, Procter & Gamble also wants to do R&D because 45 is greater than negative 10 and 85 is greater than 70. So since R&D is always the best strategy, for Procter & Gamble, it is called a dominant strategy. Okay. Now, the same thing can be said for Kimberly Clark. If you look at them again, if you look, the numbers you want to compare now, get rid of some of these colors real fast because it's getting confusing here. If you look at their payoffs, the top row is always better than the bottom row. And so that means the same thing can be said for Kimberly Clark. The same is true, or I'll put it this way, R&D is the dominant strategy for Kimberly Clark as well. So if that's the case, then there's only one possible outcome, and that's this one. Because they both want to do R&D. They both see that it's in their best interest to do R&D. So this doesn't happen very often when both sides have a dominant strategy. This one is easy to figure out what's going to happen. You're guaranteeing yourself here that both of them will do R&D because neither one has an incentive not to do R&D. All right. Now, the third one involves Jane and Jim. A movie and a ball game. I guess they figured they'll bring this down to earth a little bit. Now, once again, we have to look at these very carefully and say, well, listen, let's say we chose this cell. We can randomly start here. It doesn't really matter where we start. We're going to always end up with a correct decision. Now here, Jim would clearly rather go to the ball game. Okay. So he's not happy with this cell. This is not a Nash equilibrium. From this cell, now this is interesting because Jim does not want to, in this case, Jim does not want to go to the movie because that would lower him from 5 to 1. And Jane does not want to go to the ball game because that lowers her payoff as well. So this cell in the bottom right-hand corner is a Nash equilibrium. Oh, I just realized I made a mistake here in that solution. I didn't even notice it before. They're both Nash equilibriums. And then as far as the ball game is concerned, the same thing is happening. If they're at the ball game here, if they're both at the ball game in the upper left-hand corner, Jim will not switch back to movie because he would lower his payoff to 0. Whereas Jane, if they're both already at the ball game, there's no reason for them to switch because she would lose. Her payoff goes down from 5 to 1. So therefore, this game actually has 2 Nash equilibria. That's one of the quirky things about that word. I'll just make a little note here. The plural of equilibrium is equilibria. It's a Latin word, of course. So there's 2 Nash equilibria. If we're both, now see, I guess the point of all this is that they're happiest when they're both doing the same thing, whether it's the ball game or the movie. It almost doesn't seem to matter. Although it's pretty clear that Jim likes the ball game and Jane likes the movie, but as long as they're together. Now, because here in the upper right-hand corner, this means they're doing separate activities and they both have an incentive to switch. Down here, same thing. They're both doing separate activities and they have an incentive to switch. So therefore, these are the 2 Nash equilibria. And you can have more than one. And also, I just want to point out, there can be more than one Nash equilibrium in a game, and there may not be a Nash equilibrium at all. In other words, there doesn't have to be one. Okay, there may be dominant strategies, and there may not be any dominant strategies. So there's no guarantee that any of these even exist in the first place. Okay, so even though it says what is the Nash equilibrium, the answer could be there isn't one. Okay, so all right, well, we didn't see any of those, but that is actually a possibility as well. All right, so that's done. Now all that remains here is the sample final. Now, of course, the sample final is a mixture of all four chapters. You can see there's a lot of repetition here, but there's also some graphs this time. All right, so let's take a look at these. So here we have the characteristics of the perfectly competitive market. Now, it only asks for two, but I've listed a bunch of them. For each firm is a price taker, which means they have no control over the price that they're charging. They're all selling the exact same product. The industry has a very large number of firms. There are no barriers to entry, and they all have access to all information. In other words, they all know what the others are charging. That's one of the reasons why nobody can have a different price, because everybody knows what everybody else is doing. Now, the one thing that's interesting and very unusual about perfect competition is that the price equals the marginal revenue because the demand curve is flat. Okay, so you'll recall that here we have so yes, they're all equal to each other with perfect competition. Then we have the price elasticity of demand at the demand curve for a perfectly competitive firm. You can see because it's flat, that represents infinite elasticity. All right, the vertical one is the one that had an elasticity of 0, by the way. Now, what's the main difference between the demand curve faced by a single perfectly competitive firm and the entire industry? All right, so remember, that's the case where the entire industry is just normal. And this is the firm. Okay, downward sloping, and for us in the single firm, no, it's simply flat. Okay, that's the difference. All right, now what competition or what condition holds when the profit maximizing output is produced by a perfectly competitive firm? Again, that's true for all market structures, MR equals MC. Okay, now the shutdown point is where P equals AVC. If we fall below that point, we're losing money on every sale that we make. So therefore, we'll have to go out of business. Now, this one we've run into many times. What does it mean to be at zero economic profits? That means that P equals ATC. Oh, well, see, 7 and 8 are really the same question then, because in 7, it tells us that the ATC is where the firm is earning zero economic profits, which means that they're breaking even. So 7 and 8 are really two sides of the same coin when you think about it. Okay, a monopoly. This is a market structure, of course, in which a single firm sells the entire supply or output of a good. There's only one firm. That's it. Although what the book actually, let me do this real fast. Let me update this a tiny bit. For which there are no close substitutes, because that's an important detail. All right, because you can have a good like Coke and Pepsi. They have a monopoly on the production of Coke and Pepsi, but there's so many substitutes that they don't really have any monopoly power. All right. First degree price discrimination is the one. Now, this is only practiced by a monopolist. They're the only ones who have the market power to do this. And even for them, this would be difficult, charging each consumer the highest price that he or she is willing to pay for the good or service. All right. In other words, they figure out how much each person is willing to pay, and then they charge them that price. That would be nice, but it's very difficult to do. Second degree is different. You're just giving people quantity discounts, basically. You're charging different prices for different quantities because some people are willing to, pay more to buy more units of a product. But if you offer them a discount, they'll buy even more units of the product, and you're still making money. Like people with large families, if you say, listen, here we have soup today. It's normally $2 a can. We'll give you 15 cans for 10 or 10 cans for $15. They'll take it because they know that they can use 10 cans of soup. All right. And then third degree is the interesting one that we talked about. This is the case with Broadway tickets for the evening performance and the matinee. We're charging a different price for two different groups of consumers or two different markets. All right. And what really separates the groups is their price elasticity of demand. All right. Movie theaters, the same thing. All right. Now, the Lerner Index. There's another one of our indexes. This one, for a perfectly competitive firm, it's 0. And of course, anything higher than that represents a case where we have competition, but not perfect competition. Antitrust laws. These are used by the government to prevent monopolies from forming, although it's really more than that. They're really just trying to make sure that a single firm doesn't have too much power. In other words, they're trying to avoid having an industry be too concentrated. And of course, monopolies are what they don't want to see, but they might also just not want to see oligopolies where one firm is really dominant. So they work hard to make sure that all these firms and all these industries are reasonably competitive, especially when they're analyzing potential mergers. Now, we saw this earlier, of course. What are two ways in which monopolistically competitive firms can compete? That would be price, quality, and features. Here's HHI again. Anything under 1,500 could be considered monopolistically competitive, although as you start getting close to 0, it starts to closely resemble perfect competition. And of course, we've already seen that it only can go as high as 10,000, and that represents a monopoly because then what you've done is you've squared 100. 100% is one firm in the industry. When you square that, it becomes 10,000. Nice. All right. Collusion. We've already seen this. This is a situation where firms agree among themselves what price they'll charge in the market. We almost only, never see this with monopolistic competition. It's reserved almost exclusively to oligopolists. So can monopolistically competitive firms collude with each other? Well, no, because there are just too many of them to agree to anything, much less keep it a secret. Because remember, it's not enough to agree with each other. They have to keep it quiet because they know that it's illegal. So imagine 20 plus companies getting together and saying, listen, we're not only going to agree to a lower price or higher price rather, we're going to keep it quiet. I don't see that happening. All right, now, what would be the four-firm concentration ratio for a monopoly? That would be, of course, 100% because one firm controls the entire industry. 21, which type of market structure exhibits interdependence among the firms? That, of course, would be oligopoly. The monopolistic competitors are not so directly interdependent among themselves. There's some maybe, but mostly we think of this as being oligopoly. All right, there it is again. In which type of market structure could collusion take place? That would realistically would only be oligopoly. There'd be no need for it in monopoly. And certainly it would make no sense in perfect competition because they're already charging the same price. So realistically, this would be something that the government would be concerned about with oligopolists. Now, economies of scale occur, as we've seen in the graph that I showed you earlier, when the average total cost continues to decline as more units of a good are produced. And that's what gives us our edge over our competitors. All right, so this is why we expect to see this happening in oligopolies, because it's a huge advantage to be big in those industries. All right, a natural oligopoly arises because of this economies of scale. All right, in other words, these are the companies where they got big in a hurry, and so they will retain a permanent advantage over their competitors. And so we have a case where it's hard or impossible for anyone to break into this industry because of the cost advantages that the existing competitors have. A duopoly clearly means a firm, an oligopoly with two firms, because the duo, obviously. Ooh, now this looks pretty complicated. We have a graph. We're being asked to draw a bunch of curves. And we're going to be asked some questions about what's happening if we're not producing at the profit maximizing point of output. Ooh, okay. So let's see what this is all about. All right, so let me split up the screen so we can see what we're doing here. So that's the graph. Now, you notice I did not do this by hand. I tried to do this in Word. It turned out fairly well. It's not a masterpiece either, but let me shrink this up a bit so we can see everything at the same time. It's kind of nice. They've got the right shapes. And you can see the point in profit maximizing. In other words, Q star in profit maximizing output, of course, as always, occurs where MR equals MC. Okay, and so the corresponding quantity is our profit maximizing output. And you can see the other curves have their traditional shapes. Now, this firm happens to be making money. You can tell because of that quantity, the price is above ATC. But the question doesn't ask that. But you can tell that it's making money because the price is above ATC. So earning positive economic profits. Now, with all that being said, there's some conceptual questions that follow it. If the firm sells more than the profit maximizing output. So in other words, if you come over here and look at, let's say, you know what, let me draw a new picture just to make it a little bit more clear. Let's get this out of here. It's hard to tell from this graph. Let me just draw a new one for you. All right, it's not the best, but it'll do. And let's just say that the demand curve is flat at ATC. In fact, let me change the color here. Man. I'll tell you what, I have to do something here. Just so it's easier to read it. I'll move those titles over here, or those labels. Because what they want to know is this. Here's the break. Here's where you want to be. Okay. If you're producing, let's say, over here somewhere, I'll call that Q1. Then you should be able to tell that at Q1, MC is way up here and MR is down here. So MR is less than MC if we overproduce. We sell too many units, then our marginal revenue is less than our marginal costs. That would be Q1 in this diagram. But if we're underselling, let's say we're down here somewhere. So let me make a note here. MC is greater than MR. And then let's say we're down here. We're underproducing. You can see that here's MR, here's MC. MR is less, or is greater than MC. All right. So in other words, for part B, the answer is when we're overproducing, we're Q1, MC has risen above the MR curve, which means it's costing us more to make the product than we can sell it for. If we're underproducing at Q2, as we are here, that means it's the opposite problem. We could make more money by selling more units of this good because each extra unit brings in more revenue than costs. So those are the two cases where we're not producing at the optimum or profit maximizing output. Both of them mean that we're making less money than if we just produce a Q star. Now, what if a perfectly competitive firm tries to charge a price higher for the good than its competitors? It would not sell any units of the good at all. Okay, just lose every single one of its customers because this is perfect competition. And then finally, what is the price elasticity of demand for the goods sold by a perfectly competitive firm? We know that that's infinite because it's flat. Okay. Okay. Now for number two, we're dealing with a monopoly. So you're supposed to draw the curve for the monopolist. And so this is what it's supposed to look like. And the idea here is that the demand curve is downward sloping, marginal revenue is steeper. In this case, we don't really need the ABC curve because we're assuming that the monopolist is making a profit. And in fact, they're producing a Q star because this is where MR equals MC. But the price comes from the demand curve. So in other words, once you've identified the profit maximizing quantity, the price is way up here because it's taken from the demand curve. All right, so this point where MR equals MC is not where the price is. That's being used to identify the quantity. The price is coming from the demand curve at P star. And since P star is greater than ATC, we have positive economic profits. And that shaded region is the total of our economic profits. Because here you're multiplying the profit per unit times the quantity that you're selling. Now, here's an interesting question. What is needed for the monopolist to practice third-degree price discrimination? What conditions must be true? Well, first of all, there have to be at least two distinct markets for the good, just like with the Broadway tickets. If the consumers who show up in the daytime and the ones who come at night are exactly the same, in the sense that they have the same elasticity of demand, then the discrimination doesn't help them because they'll both want to charge or pay the same price to see the show. So there have to be two distinct markets, and it must not be possible for the consumers in the one market to resell the product in the other market. So with the Broadway tickets, that's not a problem because it says right on the ticket what time you're allowed to show up. You can't sell it to somebody who can then come at night. It doesn't work that way. So you can keep the two markets separate from each other. And so therefore it becomes possible to practice third-degree price discrimination. Oh, and of course the elasticities have to be different from each other. Again, otherwise this would make no sense at all, because then it's really all one big market. If everybody has the same elasticity of demand for this product, then there's no point. There's nothing you can do to change or raise your profits. And finally, what about sources of monopoly power? Well, we've seen quite a few of them. Maybe you have complete control over the supply of an input that is necessary to produce a good, like De Beers, diamond mines, and Alcoa bauxite, bauxite, I guess, sites where it's dug up. Possibly a patent or a trademark, which gives you a legal monopoly. Economies of scale. You might have squeezed out your competition, as we saw John D. Rockefeller did, in order to gain control of the oil markets. And then finally, government license, which applies to taxis, for example. Although that's less of it's not as good an example as it used to be before the emergence of Uber and Lyft. Before they came along, New York City taxis had an absolute monopoly, and if you wanted a taxi or a ride anywhere, it had to be a New York City taxi that had a proper license. All right, so, that was it for that one. All right, so all three of them are done. So now what we need to do is I'm going to post these on Blackboard, and if it's not already there, I'll put the final exam there, if it's maybe today or later today, or tonight possibly. And so you'll have a minimum of 1 week to hand it in, meaning next Tuesday at midnight or possibly later, and I'll let you know about that. But since we're completely done with all the new content and we're just through reviewing, that means that we can have a day off on Friday. All right, we're done. We don't need to hold any more sessions. But having said that, if you're stuck or you need information about the test or you're not sure about something, you can let me know by email and we'll get that straightened out. But other than that, we're actually done with the course. Now, interestingly enough, it's been my experience now that I've been doing this COVID thing for a while. Somehow or other, I don't know how this happens, I always end up getting through the material faster online rather than in the classroom. So that's why this happened, why we ended up finishing a little early. It's just somehow it just goes faster this way. And this is true for all of my classes, not just for this one. So, of course, in the fall, we'll be back to normal. But as for right now, we're done. So, yes, I'm just still getting some of them. But yes, it'll be later this week. I'm gathering them up. And so, although since I just started receiving, or many of them just came in very recently, like Monday, let's say, so I don't have them yet, but I'm aiming for the end of the week, maybe the weekend. Anybody else? All right. So, well, it's always sad when the semester ends, I think, But I hope that you got something out of this class, and that even if you're not an economics major, a lot of these principles will prove to be useful when you're studying other business courses. And because micro is a very interesting and important area, and a lot of, I mean, business decisions are based directly on microeconomics. In fact, if you go to MBA school, Master of Business Administration school, everybody has to take a course called managerial economics, which is essentially applied microeconomics, because that's how useful it is for business decision making. So it's not just, even though it's very theoretical and abstract, but it's also incredibly useful, and that's the important detail. Plus, it's just interesting. Oh, so what I'm going to do is post the solutions today. I have to look in my archives and see if the final exam is completely ready. If it's not, I'll have it up there later on today or tonight. But you'll have at least a week to get it done. So there's the earliest that they'll be due is next Tuesday at midnight. I might be able to give you more time. I have to call the school and find out exactly when all the grades are due, but we'll call it at least next Tuesday night, and maybe beyond that, but I'll let you know about that. So you should probably just assume that they're due on Tuesday the 11th, unless you have a real emergency of some kind. And but like I said, if I can give you more time, I'll let you know about that. But what you're probably your best strategy is just to assume that they're all due on the 11th. Okay. Yes, you're welcome. All right. Anyone else? All right. Now it's going to be weird in the fall. If you show up in one of my classes in the fall, I mean, under the circumstances, it's possible that I won't even recognize you. So if that happens, you've got to come up and say, listen, I was in your micro class. I want to know. Okay. Because obviously I can't see you. And so if you do show up in one of my classes, I'd like to see you again. That would be nice. But you'll probably have to just remind me, because, let's face it, it's not the same, is it? Online. It's just not. So anyway, all right, I guess we're done then. And so good luck with all your other exams. And who knows, maybe I'll see you again in a future class. All right. So I just wanted to say goodbye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad you thought so. I like that to hear that. Yeah, I hope it kept it interesting. All right. You're welcome, everyone.